and then we'll get started. Thanks for being here with us on this sort of nice spring evening, depending on where you are. So feel free to unmute yourself. Let us know where you're calling in from. Let us know your role in long-term care.
Hi there, I'm Sherry Cariso. I'm a registered nurse at Beckley Farm Lodge in James Bay.
Welcome, Sherry. Thanks for coming tonight.
And Lorraine G. from Beckley Farm Lodge. I'm the home manager.
Oh, hi, Lorraine. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm Cheryl Cleish, Director of Care at the Heights at Montview in Victoria.
Hi, Cheryl. So we're just going to give everyone a couple more minutes to log on here, and then we'll get started. Thank you for being here tonight. Okay, so we'll just start with a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll hand off to our presenter, Marissa. So welcome to our Victoria South Island Long-Term Care, a learning series event on cultural safety. So today will be an introductory event, and we're hoping to have another event in the fall focusing on more specific cultural safety topics of long-term care. So I'm Jessica, the Victoria South Island Long-Term Care Initiative Program Manager. I'd like to take a moment to welcome you to our LTCI Learning Series event this evening with Marissa McIntyre. It is with great respect and appreciation that I am speaking to you on this sort of beautiful spring day today from the traditional and ancestral territories of the Sauk Nation, where I'm very lucky to work and live. So just a couple of housekeeping items. Please keep yourself muted during the event unless you'd like to ask a question. This is a CME event. A certificate will be emailed to you in the coming days by a member of our team. Please take a moment to complete our evaluation form at the end of the event. Your feedback is important to us. This event will be recorded and placed on our website along with a copy of the slides. So please feel free to share the link with your colleagues who are unable to attend today. If you have questions throughout the evening, please unmute yourself and ask away. We like these events to be as interactive as possible. There will also be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Last but not least, I would like to introduce our presenter for this evening, Marissa McIntyre from Len Pierre Consulting. Marissa is a First Nations and mixed settler woman living in the unceded territory of the Kwantlen, the Katsi, the Semiahmoo, the Tsawwassen, the Kaikate, and the Kwikwetlam First Nations. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Simon Fraser University and currently works for the Fraser Health Authority as a cultural safety educator and clinical lead of Indigenous health. We are very lucky to have her speak to us today, so without further ado, please welcome Marissa.
Hi, thank you so much for that really nice introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Marissa McIntyre, as was already said. My traditional name is Kinechko, and it means helping water in my language. I'm going to get the slides up and running just for now. I usually get ahead of myself with the introductions, and then I realize that I have slides designated for those introductions. So I'm not going to get ahead of myself today. So today we're going to be doing kind of a introduction, a shorter form introduction to our Indigenous cultural safety and humility slides presentation. This full curriculum with LPC is about 3.5 hours. So today it is quite condensed, and it was so hard for me to pick specific slides to give to you. I just wanted to give you all of the information that I think all of it's so important. So it was really hard for me to pick certain ones out. So with that said, I might be racing through some of the slides. I might go through concepts a little fast. So if that's the case, if you're needing me to slow down, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. I absolutely welcome questions throughout the session. I've kind of allotted like a 20-minute chunk of time for questions, and whether all 20 minutes of that is at the end of the session or if it's scattered throughout, that's kind of how I design my presentations. So feel free to unmute yourself at any time. Use the Q&A function if you're more comfortable with that, but please don't be shy. I think I saw a statistic one time that if one person in a room full of 10 has a question, there's a very high likelihood that another person has that exact same question in a classroom setting. So again, don't be scared. Don't be worried about asking a question that might come across as ignorant, or just you're nervous to just speak up in a group. So I'm from the Ntlaka'pamux Nation, which is in interior BC. Specifically, my family is from Lytton in that area. My dad was raised in Lytton, and then I think he moved to Surrey, which is now where I live, when he was maybe like 20, 21. I was born and raised in Surrey. And I spent some time in Abbotsford. I lived there for a few years, 5 years, and now I'm back in Surrey just because of work and Fraser Health and Frasca, where I worked before, all being in Surrey. So kind of made my way back there. And I don't know where I'm going to go next, but it's kind of where I'm at. So today my intention is to create a knowledge exchange. I absolutely recognize that everyone in this call comes with a great amount of their own knowledge and experiences and their own teachings as well. And so I want to welcome this to be a conversation. You'll kind of already tell based on how I'm introducing myself that this is my presentation style. I really just want it to be conversational. I want it to be a comfortable space for people to ask questions they wouldn't normally have an opportunity to ask. And like I said, I absolutely welcome questions throughout that session. Now, before we get started, I wanted to do a territory acknowledgement for where I'm phoning in from today. Jessica, thank you for doing one on behalf of the presentation. But I'm not actually phoning in from where I live. I'm at a friend's house right now because I had a meeting in this area, and then I came here and she has a nice stand-up desk. So I'm doing my presentation here. But I'm phoning in from the Stalo territory today, which is colonially known as the Chilliwack area. So I'm very grateful. I do a lot of work out here with Fraser Health, and this area is absolutely gorgeous. I spend a lot of my spare time here. It's beautiful, and I'm very grateful to be able to do this presentation today from the unceded territory of several Stalo nations. So thank you for having me. All right, now, time sensitive. I can stop talking about myself and get into the presentation. So this first part, we're going to kind of go through why we need Indigenous cultural safety. We're going to lay out kind of where our prejudice comes from, where discrimination comes from, and really what the colonial systems has done to the way that we think, especially those who went through the school system or were raised in Canada. There's a lot of internal bias, and there's a lot of prejudice that people aren't aware of, or if they're aware of it, they don't know where it's come from. So before we get into that, I am going to go over some terminology. Now, when working with Indigenous people, they're going to ask you to refer to them the way that they want to be referred to, and it might not be on this list. However, this list that we kind of provide are, one, the terminology that I will be using throughout the session, so it kind of gets all of us on the same page, but also what I like to say, the press conference safe terms for now. These are deemed most culturally safe right now until any new information comes out or people start feeling a different way. But I want us to all be on the same page. So I'm going to start with the terms Indigenous and Aboriginal. Now, these are used interchangeably with Canada. In the Canadian context, both are used to describe original people before a colonial country was formed. So we're kind of seeing a shift away from Aboriginal, and people are not understanding why. Aboriginal, I would say, is very Canadian-centric. If you were to go to the States and say Aboriginal to describe the Indigenous people of that area, it may not be as recognized as a term than Indigenous whereas Indigenous is that worldwide, globally recognized term. It's more of an has an international use. When we think of things like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it is generally the universal term to use. We're also seeing kind of a shift away from the term Aboriginal just because of that Latin prefix of ab. When you think of words like abnormal, it means not normal. So a lot of people kind of feel like it's a cheeky way for the government to continue to not acknowledge people as original peoples. I'm going to pause here. I heard someone unmute, but I'm not sure if it was a mistake or if someone had a question. So I'm just going to take a pause. And if anyone does have a question, now could be a good time. All right. So Indigenous and Aboriginal, I would say, are both culturally safe, but a lot of people, they just come into these sessions and they're like, just tell me which one to start off with. And I would say Indigenous is the most culturally safe one to start off with, to start a conversation. Once you have more information, you can take a distinctions-based approach. So First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are the three Indigenous peoples that you would find within these colonial borders of Canada. A lot of people think that Aboriginal is a synonym for First Nations, and that's not the case. It's a synonym for Indigenous, just in our context. So taking that distinctions-based approach, First Nations is the term that replaced Indian back in the 1970s, and these are the land-based nations that can trace their heritage back to the traditional territory. When we do a territory acknowledgement, it is a First Nations tradition. It is a protocol, really, that people are invited to do. A lot of people have this misconception that territory acknowledgements, because it kind of had this rise out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, people see it as something that is new, that is because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But we have been doing territory acknowledgements or something very similar to it since before contact. This is an invitation for people to participate in our culture. And we honestly do something very similar to a territory acknowledgement when we go to people's houses. Usually people at some point will say, "Thank you for having me. Your house is lovely. It was so good to see you. Hope to see you soon." And that's not really that different from a territory acknowledgement. It's just this idea of a home is applied to the land and the connection to the land other than a building. And also just basic, grammar and situational context. We wouldn't speak to someone in their home and say, "I'd like to thank Jessica for having me in her home," as I'm speaking to Jessica. So it's slightly different the way that we phrase it, but it is a traditional teaching that people are being invited to participate in. So long-winded, kind of off topic, but very much on topic for understanding First Nations culture right off of the bat. So First Nations, again, is the term that replaced the word Indian in the 1970s. Indian is not a culturally safe term when referring to Indigenous peoples. It's a very outdated term, but there are some situations where in legal definition, we would still use the term Indian, but we can get into that a little later. Now, Métis is a nation made up of the descendants of Indigenous women and Eurosettler men. The Métis are a very distinct nation with their own history, culture, languages, and territories, with the deep historical roots in the three prairie provinces. Now, again, a misunderstanding that because people know how the historic Métis nation was formed, they think that that gets extended down the line. That gets extended down the ancestral line. So a lot of people think that because my grandmother was white and my grandpa was Native, that makes me and my family Métis. But that's not the case. You have to be able to trace your lineage back to the historic Métis nation, because anywhere further down that line, you are simply, mixed settler and First Nations. Those are two completely different cultures. Just like someone can be Irish and Scottish, you can be Scottish and Cree, and that doesn't magically make you a Métis person. Now, Inuit live in the northern region of Canada, so Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Northern Quebec, and Northern Labrador. And sometimes we hear this term Inuk or Inuk. I've seen it spelled INUK, which is, I believe, how it's usually spelled, but I've also seen it spelled phonetically with ENOCH. And I'm not sure if someone was just spelling it out that way for pronunciation or if that is a different way of spelling. But either way, when someone says that, grammatically, it would just be referring to a singular person. Inuit means people in their language. And so Inuk would mean person, which is why we don't say Inuit people, because it's redundant. We really want to center their language and the meanings of those languages. So try to avoid saying Inuit people and just say Inuit. Now, does anyone have any questions about this terminology? You can go back to it at a later time if you need.
Hi,
Hi.
Marissa. I do have a question. Sherry here.
Yes.
I'm just
Hi.
wondering, like, for the like when referring to somebody as First Nations, is that for a specific group of people? Because you're kind of doing the you're showing the prairie provinces and the territories in northern Quebec, but what about, like, say, on Ontario? Can you just clarify that a bit?
Yeah, so it would depend on which area you're in, because there's lots of First Nations in the prairie provinces. But for that specifically, for the Métis, they have their own traditional territories as well. So when I'm in Chilliwack, I'm in Stolo Nation, but depending on where I am in Chilliwack, I'm also part of the Intlak'letma Nation if I'm far back enough for, let's say, Lindeman Lake. So the borders overlap slightly, and they're a little bit, there's overlap, and then it's not the same as, it wouldn't be the same as the colonial borders that we have. So within Ontario, let's say, I don't know exactly, but there would be like several First Nations that are part of Ontario, but they would also cross over the colonial borders because we didn't have those lines, right? We didn't have those hard stops, and that's why we have some nations like Blackfoot that extend into the States as well, because we didn't have the Canada-US border. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but
Yeah, I think it did. Thank you so
okay.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Think of existing borders, not really borders, but think of existing areas and regions and borders, and then Canada and US came and put theirs on top rather than working with what was already there. It's just like having a coloring book and then coloring your own things over top of it, if that is a good analogy. All right, does anyone else have any questions? All right, let's move on just for the sake of time. And if people do have a question, we can come back to it. So we like to start off this next session with a quote by Justice Murray Sinclair, and it kind of sets the tone for the prejudice that we talked about and our internalized prejudice that all of us have. So the quote is, while Indigenous children were being mistreated in residential schools by being told they were heathen, savages, and pagans, and inferior people, that same message was being delivered in the public schools of this country. And that's something that we often overlook. If people went to school here in Canada, a lot of the times what we usually get as feedback is up until recent years. So people that are still in high school, really, we didn't learn much about Indigenous peoples. And if we learned about Indigenous peoples, it was through a very settler colonial lens. Think about when you would have learned about the fur trade. From whose perspective was it? It was seen, at least when I was taught it was seen as a very positive thing, part of the birth of Canada and the rise of Canada and how we're all here today. And it really lacks that Indigenous perspective. And I am very grateful and lucky enough to have gone to a school where my teacher took it upon herself to teach us about residential schools the best that she can, with the time and the constraints that we had. But I was very shocked when I got to university and I had someone in like a third year Canadian history course not know what residential schools were and question their truth, because it was the first time they were hearing about it. And so I learned in third year of Simon Fraser that other people didn't know about it. And so I'm very lucky that our whole class, even though our whole class was only 17 people, I went to a very small school, but I'm very lucky that our whole class got that information, and at least we weren't lost to some of what happened. But with that being said, it was still the mandatory learnings about Louis Riel, the fur trade, was of one very specific perspective, and it was a very positive perspective. It wasn't showing how Indigenous people were affected. So when that's a lot of our experience, we have gaps of knowledge. And what happened before, we had this several generations of people that didn't really learn a lot. We had people being taught explicitly racist information in the school system, in the public school system. As we'll see on the next slide, you're going to see a Canadian history textbook that was published in 1953 that shows Indigenous people, or First Nations specifically, with horns on our head. And so these horrible things that we learn about, that people are kind of catching up to learning about now with residential schools, what the kids went through, what they were told, that message was also being delivered, as Justice Marie Sinclair says, to the public school system. So when we have a gap of knowledge, we either let society fill in the gaps, or we go and we ask our elders. And our elders, or people that went to school before us, are going to have racist, outdated information. So the people that don't do that and don't take that route are using this that you see on the screen here to fill in those gaps. So the top right here, you can see this is a clip from a Canadian history textbook, that one I was talking about, Breastplate and Buckskin. And it was published in 1953, and it shows Indigenous people that were dressed as devils who pranced about the fire trying to scare Cartier. And this is a very inaccurate depiction of what Indigenous people looked like. The top left, Pocahontas, as a movie, really romanticizes First Nations settler relationships. And it's completely historically inaccurate. Pocahontas's real name is Matoka, and she was, I don't know the exact age, but somewhere between like 10 and 14, and was taken and forced to marry a man in their 30s, like 35, I believe he was. And so this really shows the relationship between Matoka and Jon Snow, or John Rolfe, I believe, as this super consensual, beautiful marrying of two cultures, where she like sacrifices herself and goes to a new world for a new adventure and all of these things. But Indigenous people recognize her as one of the first missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and she was very young. So it just paints, dare I say, paints with the colors of the wind, a very different picture of what Canada's relationship, or North America, Turtle Island's relationship with Indigenous people and settlers were. Now, the bottom middle, this one is going to break some hearts. This is a one of the episodes of the Looney Tunes. And as you can see, Bugs Bunny here is defending the fort, and he is singing this song that goes 1, little 2, little 3, little Indians, and then he goes and shoots and then puts a tally on the scoreboard. And then you can actually see it here in this photo. At one point he erases half and says, oh, that one was just a half breed. So even this concept of blood quantum and this concept of, Indigenous people just being a score, a tally to put up, and the violence towards Indigenous people, it is at a very young age, at a very impressionable age, where we're taking in a lot of information, and it's forming the way that we see the world, and it's forming the way that we think. The bottom left with these examples of different mascots, this contributes to the dehumanization and humiliation of Indigenous people as well. If you think of other mascots in the same sports leagues, whatever it is, sports type, a lot of the times it's either inanimate objects or animals, and then Indigenous people. So we're put in the same category even today as inanimate objects and animals. So this is kind of what we're consuming, and then this is what creates prejudice. So all areas here of Canadian socialization is what forms our learned behavior and our learned thoughts. Now, prejudice, up until I really started teaching this, I thought prejudice and discrimination were the same thing. I thought, I was told, live your life without prejudice. If you're prejudiced, you're a bad person, but we don't actually have control over prejudice at all. It's that first thought or that first feeling that pops up into your head. And like I said, it's learned behavior. So let's take Indigenous people out of the equation and maybe think back to a time where you're in public or you saw something online and you had a really judgy thought that popped up into your head without even feeling like you prompted that thought. It was just like stimuli went into your brain, thought came out. And I've had that. I think it was probably like the way someone dressed or the car that they drove, but something along those lines. And I had a really judgy thought pop up into my head. And I sat there and was like, am I a bad person? Like, if the first thought that pops up into my head about somebody is a really rude judgment, then does that mean at my core I'm a bad person? And it's actually the opposite. That's just your learned behavior. And what you do with that information, questioning it, not acting on it, or the behavior that you put out after, that is more so who you are as a person. So what that could look like is a fear of Indigenous people or a disgust towards Indigenous people. And this is something that's not going to go away overnight. After spending an hour and a half together, or even throughout the whole learning series, this is not something that's going to go away. It's something that we have to unlearn over years and years. Now, discrimination is when it turns into action. So this is when people are ignored, treated with aggression. People make assumptions about their use, substance use or alcohol, which leads to inadequate preliminary testing, which leads to misdiagnosis or leads to negligence. So this is when our prejudice turns into action, whether knowingly or unknowingly, because sometimes when we have a really judgy thought pop up, that's good because we can talk to it and we can say, where did that come from? I'm not going to act on this. This is something I'm going to unpack later. And when it's quiet, it's kind of like nudging us to go in a certain direction that we wouldn't want to go. So when it's loud, that's good. Talk to it, question it, have a conversation. And when it's quiet, just always ask yourself what you're doing and why. We can't just sit down and be like, oh, you know what, this Sunday, I'm going to sit down and unpack all of my prejudice and really question it and then fix all of that. It's not going to happen. We have to deal with it as it comes up in different situations. So years later, maybe 20 years from now, and you've been doing all of this work, there's still going to be things that pop up. It is a lifelong journey of unlearning. So don't expect change immediately. Now, does anyone have questions about this Canadian socialization, the forming of prejudice, anything? Or even a comment? All right, we'll move on. Again, for the sake of time, some of my feedback is that I've received is that I need to wait a little bit longer for people to kind of get the confidence to ask a question. So sometimes I'll leave like a very awkward length of pause, just so people feel like if I don't say something, it's going to continue to be awkward. So I'm cutting those a little short today, but I really do encourage people, if you have a question, clarification, or even a comment or reflection, to really, engage in the conversation. I like to learn. I love to learn too. So if I can take anything new out of this, I would love that as well. All right, moving on. So this one, unfortunately, we won't have time to really unpack all of these today, but these are just some examples of different forms of institutional oppression that Indigenous people deal with in our systems daily. So the one that I really want to talk about, and really we're seeing a shift in healthcare towards, is reward for conformity and the shift towards equity rather than equality. I feel like in North America, we are kind of conditioned to think that equality is the highest level of treatment that you can give someone. And we're seeing, like I said, in healthcare, a push towards equity. And what I'm seeing is a pushback from that, because one, the healthcare system is so overloaded right now. People are burnt out. There is just, our system is very, very overworked and overloaded. So one of the pushbacks that I receive is, I don't even have time or the capacity to do equity, to provide equitable care. I barely have the capacity to provide equal care. And to that, I would say that there's a way for us to kind of pick and choose our battles, if that makes sense. We always want to be taking that equity focus, and honestly, we do. Now, equality is giving everyone the same handout, right? Everyone gets the exact same treatment, no matter what. Equity would be acknowledging people's starting points and giving everyone an equal outcome, an equal opportunity for outcome. And if we're taking a look at like the emergency department, let's say, a lot of people already practice equity in certain situations, but they don't realize they practice equity. So I'm going to give because I know this is recorded and going to be public, I'm going to give a content warning for domestic abuse, just the general concept. If two people went into the emergency room, both with the exact same cut on, I don't know, their arm or their hand or their forehead or something, exact same, the actual fixing of that wound, cleaning and stitches if needed, are going to be the exact same thing. But when questioning about the mechanism of injury, usually if someone says, I got into a fight with my partner and they threw a glass at me and it cut my hand, we are going to give them more time and space. And usually we will connect them with resources if they want it, or we will connect them with community programs, give them a quiet room to continue to tell their story, especially if they come in with that partner. We already practice equity in that way, because if someone said, oh, you know what, I went to the pool and I slipped and I like sliced my hand on an open locker or something, we're going to be like, oh, silly you, patch you up, send you home. Those extra steps aren't going to happen, but we do it anyway for the people that need those extra steps. So when we're taking a look at the trauma that has been experienced in the healthcare system, both historically and recently, if we take a look at the In Plain Sight report that was published at the end of 2020, there is distinct harm to Indigenous people that have happened within all of BC's healthcare system. And as we're going to get into later, Indian hospitals, a huge, huge impact on Indigenous people and their relationship with healthcare. So if they need a little bit extra time to acclimate to the space, if they just need a quieter space to be, then we understand we don't have the capacity all the time, but maybe when we do have capacity, we can provide. So just to summarize everything with a metaphor, my favorite. Equality would be giving all of you the exact same prescription of glasses. I went to Shoppers Drug Mart. I got everyone the same pair of readers. They're purple with flowers on them. Some of you hate them, some of you love them. Either way, they're the same prescription. Equality would be giving you all that same handout. Here's your giveaway. Here's your happy glasses. Now everyone needs to see. And when someone says, well, I don't see with that prescription, I need something stronger. If I came back with, you're wanting special treatment, there's something wrong with you because that person sees fine with these glasses. So you need to just try harder with what you're given. That's silly. We're not going to do that. We're going to say, oh, Queen, of course you need a different prescription. Silly me. Equity would be making sure that all of the lenses are tailored to our eyesight, because what we want is everyone to be able to see. That's what we want. We don't want everyone to just have the same thing and tell them to figure it out. So equity is really the push that we're going for, and we're going for not demonizing it or not villainizing the idea of equity, because whenever we see it used, people will call it special treatment, and they'll not call it that out of kindness. So really, this is where the focus needs to be on what we're seeing. Now, does anyone have any questions about any of the other ones that's really itching you that you want me to answer? Does anyone have any reflections on equity or the differences between? All right, you got me. Let's move on. So these next couple of slides, I need people to pull themselves out of the structure, and I need people to pull themselves right now. I've kind of been wanting you to put yourself in the shoes, see how this applies to your life. But right now, for these couple of slides, what I want everyone to do is take a step back from it and see this, what I'm going to explain next, as kind of a whole structure of Canada itself and the services that we offer to people and the systems that we have in place. Because I'm just going to be honest, I lose people here with these slides, these next couple of ones, because people either feel the urge to get defensive, or they feel like they need to. I don't want anyone to think that I'm applying this to you individually. And I don't want anyone to feel like they have to get defensive with me. Okay. This is just a honest conversation about the structures that exist. And structures, not talking about you or individuals or anything that you're doing wrong. We're just going to take a step back from it. Okay. So let's get into this. When Canada was formed, it laid a foundation, right? So that foundation for how Canada was formed is colonialism, because by definition, that is what happened. That is how power was taken back from, or taken away from Indigenous people. Just by definition, that's exactly what happened, okay? So we lay out this foundation. Let's choose brick, okay? So imagine this is an actual structure. We lay some bricks down. That's colonialism. That's what we're doing to make this little gazebo arch thing. Now, we need to establish some systems in this government, in this society. So we gotta make a map, right? Like, If we laid it out with bricks, we should make the structures, the pillars also match. So we make these systems, justice, social services, healthcare, and education. We make it out of the same bricks that we laid the foundation for. And then that upholds the colonial ideology, because we're going to make the roof out of those same bricks as well. Because the bottom is made with, at a certain time in society, by certain people of power and by certain structures that already existed elsewhere, these structures are going to remain intact. So it does not matter who you put at the top of each of these pillars. It doesn't change that this is made of bricks. It doesn't change it to stone because you put someone that is made of stone at the top, for example. So this is the slide, stay with me, where we're taking a look at what these bricks are made of. The one that really gets people and really kind of makes people shut down is this white supremacy brick, let's say. So when we say white supremacy, again, we've kind of been conditioned in North America to think that white supremacy is this extreme example of outward violent racism. Okay, white supremacy is not just that. It definitely is that. But white supremacy is also the little things that we don't notice, that we don't see. It's centering, it's the Eurocentrism in a lot of our policies. And even the way that fashion is, or the way that we see professionalism. Think about, how you greet someone, what type of communication styles there are. If there's other communication styles, how it's kind of seen as other, or the fact that up until a couple decades ago, we had white people playing people of color in different roles. There are many Indigenous Black actors that were available, but they would often cast people who were white in those roles and positions. So those are some examples of white supremacy that kind of make up these systems. For social services, for example, now this is also being changed, and I'm going to get into the renovations of this structure in a little bit, but for social services, for example, there were certain policies that needed to be followed if a family didn't fit this Eurocentric model, this nuclear family model. It was seen kind of as a red flag and usually a call to a social worker or a call for child apprehension. We're seeing obviously a shift away from that now. But for a very long time, when these structures were created, there was one model, and it was white people in power saying, this is our culture, this is how we operate things, so this is how we need to operate. Even justice systems, having jail, having the way that we go through decision making, our government structures, it was one system. It wasn't made, some of the bricks of stone, some of the bricks of brick, some of them of, I don't know, moss, who knows, but it was just one system and one structure. So when we take a step even further back, we see what Canada was really built on and the colonialism that it was built on. And it really, again, dominates one view and one perspective. Male supremacy, even a very patriarchal society, women not having the right to vote until recently, Indigenous people, with our Indian Act, for example, Indigenous women losing status if they wanted to marry someone who is non-status. Not to say non-Indigenous, but if a status man wanted to marry a non-status woman, she would gain status. She would be recognized as an Indian by the state. So very patriarchal acts throughout all of this. Now,
Marissa, yeah, can you please just elaborate a little tiny bit on the exploitation and when under the healthcare? What do you mean by that, and how did it manifest the exploitation?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be under just healthcare. It's just kind of in a whatever order right now. But it would be in all of the systems: education, justice, social services. For exploitation, The thing that comes to mind most of the time is like research and evaluation, and how people would kind of come in, ask Indigenous people about their way of life, try and understand them, and then take that out of context or use that as fuel for why we should be, for example, removing children, Indigenous children, from environments. Or they would kind of they would go in, research and evaluate, and then use that for harm in various ways. And it could be taking the information and passing it off as like the new way of doing things, and I completely created it, and it's not traditional knowledge, it's from my brain. And then that person like getting honorary degrees or that kind of thing. But mostly what I think of is the social services for exploitation. So I apologize for that not being clear. These examples between all of the pillars are not, and I don't know if I think you were just kind of directing me to where it is on the screen, but these are kind of embedded in all of the pillars, not just the ones that they're beside. So yeah.
Thank you. Some of the terminology I hadn't heard before, like the saviorism, I haven't heard that before, and I haven't heard of beast of the land before. Can you just?
I'd love to expand on those.
Thank you.
So saviorism is kind of when people, you may have heard of white saviorism, and it's kind of this line between allyship and saviorism where people will come in and take either a savior approach or a social justice approach. So those people that kind of come in and speak on behalf of Indigenous people because they're incapable of doing so themselves, or they need the help. That is taking a charity model. So that ties into saviorism. I'm blanking on an actual example, but basically when people come in, speak on behalf of Indigenous people without that engagement, and then decide what's best for them, which is what we've seen a lot, especially in the justice system, all of these systems, really deciding what's best for Indigenous people as a people. That is a savior approach. When people come in and they say, hey, I understand that you're tired of repeating yourselves a million times, let me step into that line of fire for you. That is the social justice approach. That's when we have allyship. So that's saviorism. Beasts of the land is, when settlers came here, and really not settlers, but colonizers, really, like the people that were forming the country. So I'm talking about like Christopher Columbus, for example. When they came over, they had journals. And you can read Christopher Columbus's journal. It's absolutely atrocious. But in the journals, the earliest writing and the earliest reference to Indigenous people was referring to us as beasts of the land. And other beasts of the land, when they got here, were bear, moose, deer, other animals. So we were seen as animals, and we were seen as kind of just beings, beasts that inhabited the space that they wanted to move into. So this is just the earliest perceptions of Indigenous people and how it's kind of embedded into our systems. And a lot of people, actually, I only learned this recently, there's a common myth that Indigenous people don't feel pain. And Indigenous people have like a higher pain tolerance. And a lot of people believe that that is kind of tied into this very long-standing perception of us being animals and us being beasts of the land, because a lot of people have that perception towards animals too, that animals don't feel pain, even though that's not the case. Now, another one that I wanted to point out is parochial on here. And I could be mixing up these definitions, but my understanding, actually, I'm 99% sure that this is a brick that's already been replaced. So I was talking about renovations. If we were to just take a sledgehammer to one of these systems and just smack the whole thing down, it's going to crumble. So what we've seen is some caution tape goes up. a little notice comes out and says, hey, we're renovating, you know, just so you know, we're going to look a little differently. And we see these bricks be replaced, and we see them chunk by chunk, a little bit at a time. We let the cement settle, and it's going to take a bit to renovate these systems, because we're not just going to, you know, have scaffolding hold up the structure and then break it all down, because that's not possible. So parochial is an example of a brick that's kind of already been replaced. And that is where I think specifically Christianity is embedded in all of the school systems. And of course, we have Catholic and Christian-based schools that people choose to put their children in, but it's not the dominating religion that is embedded in all of our education systems. We don't have kids at every school they go to, you know, reciting a prayer, the beginning and the end. So this is something that we've already seen a shift away from. And we're still in the process of renovating a lot of these systems, but every single one of these systems is already in that process. They already have the caution tape up, and some of these bricks have already been replaced. Now, I'm going to open up for questions in a second, but I just wanted to highlight residential schools. Because we don't have a lot of time for me to deep dive into it, I know that most people are going to be aware of residential schools, but I wanted to give you some highlights, okay? So the highlights are that the last one closed in 1996, and the first one opened in 1831. A lot of people think they closed even in like the 60s or 70s, which is very recent, but they closed 27 years ago. And there's a lot of evidence to support that there were some day schools, which were still segregated institutions that were supposed to be kind of like schools that we have now. You know, you go to school, come home at the end of the day. But there are some people that are saying that they stayed there for weeks at a time or months at a time. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next couple of years we find that the last one's closed in 1998 or 1997, because that's when those ones had shut down. So residential schools are very, very recent. Okay, you could have a 30-year-old, 31, that has active memories of attending a residential school. Okay, so it's not just elders, it's anyone of any age above 30 that really could have gone to these schools. Okay, now there were tons of starvation, nutrition, and vaccine experiments that were done on the children in the schools, on top of the regular abuse that people are kind of learning about, the mass deaths that occurred at a lot of these schools. There is also healthcare kind of playing a role, you know, the experimentation, which we're also going to learn about in Indian hospitals in a second. So I just want people to know that residential school basically has affected every Indigenous person that you will come across. Both of my grandparents went to residential school. So this is something that, I mean, we never want to make assumptions, but I would say just assume that any person that you come across, any patient, any client, anything who identifies as Indigenous is going to have a connection to residential schools somehow. And it might be very direct. Okay? So, oh goodness, sorry. Sorry about that. I'm just going to close the door for a second. Don't you love working from home? All right. So Gabby is no longer in the room with us. That is okay, but she's fun to be the star of the show for a second. So Indian hospitals, these were racially segregated hospitals across Canada used to originally treat tuberculosis because of a fear among health officials at the time that Indian TB posed a greater danger to the non-Aboriginal population. So these operated from the late 19th to the late 20th century, and I think the last one closed in 1988. It's noteworthy for everyone on the call here that there was a very large one in Nanaimo. I believe St. Paul's in Vancouver was also technically an Indian hospital at one point, or they had a wing or a ward that was specific as an Indian hospital. And it wasn't just, I mean, there were tons, again, vaccine experiments, medical experiments that were done. But it was kind of used as long-term holding. So people would kind of graduate from residential school and then they would just go immediately into the Indian hospitals. People were tied to the beds for days, weeks, or months at a time. And this is where a lot of forced sterilization of women occurred. And it wouldn't even be just like, oh, hey, by the way, you can't have kids now. Thank you. Thank you for waking up. It would be like they wouldn't be told until years and years down the road. They're trying to have children. They go to a physician. They take a look, they take a peek, and they're like, you've had a procedure done. Did you not know? So it would be like secret. They wouldn't know about. Now, on top of that, these institutions were severely underfunded, understaffed, and under-resourced, often infested with fleas, bed bugs, rats. And like I said, patients were tied to the beds for days, weeks, or months at a time, but there were also people that underwent lung surgery under local anesthesia instead of general. So huge neglect. I believe at one point you can see a photo of the person who was the health minister at the time, I believe, shaking hands with someone and applauding them for the amount of money they have saved at the Indian hospitals and how low the cost was, because they were just cutting corners and extremely negligent. So this is going to cause severe trauma and trust when the last one closed in the 80s. And even if someone themselves didn't go to an Indian hospital, they know someone who did, more than likely, and that fear kind of gets passed down. So now I want to open it up to any questions, comments, or reflections. And if you want me to go back, we can. I know that a lot of people kind of sit here and feel like there's a lot to just take in. So I totally get if that's what you're doing as well, just kind of taking it all in. Okay. Well, I didn't want to end this section so horrible. So I wanted to give you some examples of where the bricks are doing a really good job of being replaced. These are really some steps towards reconciliation that we're seeing within those 4 systems. The kindergarten to grade 12 transformation within BC, excellent job. They're making it now mandatory to learn about Canada's true history, residential schools, and making it at an age-appropriate level. Health standardization and the embedding of Indigenous cultural safety into those standards is a huge win for health, and a really good step towards decolonization, because really a lot of people see decolonization as like moving towards an Indigenous perspective on things, but it's not necessarily just that. It is removing the dominating colonial perspective that already existed and allowing other space to come in. So an example, let's go with education again. We originally, by a colonial model, only had 3 types of learners. We had tactile, visual, and audio or auditory. Kinesthetic is very new, but it is a very decolonial perspective, because those original 3 were really from the colonial perspectives. So kinesthetic is understanding that kids have to run, they have to do things, they have to move around, they have to expel energy. And there's more than just the 4 learner types now. But that's an example of how decolonizing approaches are really, really beneficial for everybody, because it's just saying, hey, this one's not working for you. So clearly there's a different model that we need to go with. Now, getting back to this slide, ICS training and education, we're kind of seeing in all areas. We're making sure that people are informed, because the reality is Canadians have been absolutely robbed of the information. Canadians have not been given information about residential schools or Indian hospitals or anything to do with any of the negative views of Canada, because how can Canada be this super happy, multicultural, wonderful place if they're kind of giving you their negative resume? You know, so this has really been hidden from people for years. And even when people get information about like residential schools, how long they operated, 60 Scoop, and how, you know, they would have had a kid that went to residential school if they were Indigenous, they get mad because they feel like, as a Canadian, this is their right to know this information. So the ICS education and training is really beneficial in bringing everyone up to the same page and the same speed. And it's going to take a bit because it's a lot of information we've been denied, but it's a good step. The decolonization of the academy is accepting other forms of traditional knowledge. So as we know with universities, we would have to have like a peer-reviewed source. It had to be from a specific type of article, journal article, whatever. But now oral history is being accepted. Other forms of knowledge is being accepted as well. And then I mentioned before the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so BC has created an act to uphold UNDRIP. So this would be the BC Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, basically saying we are upholding the values that this is how Indigenous people need to be consulted with, treated, and basically, you know, have rights on their own land. Now, I had a question in the chat, how long did the 60 Scoop last? So I am still, admittedly, learning about the millennial scoop myself. I haven't really had a chance to deep dive into it, but the 60 Scoop itself lasted until the 80s or 90s. By the 70s, 60 to 70% of all children in care were Indigenous. And do keep in mind that with the, let's say like the millennial scoop, there's a lot of, you know, we need to remove this child because there's neglect or abuse or this, and most of that would be fake. A lot of it would be fake and just fabricated. But at the end of the day, there had to be proof of abuse, neglect, or something for child apprehension. And there still does today, right? Like there needs to be a tangible, very good reason to remove a child from a family. For the 60 Scoop itself, it was just enough that they were Indigenous that was seen as an unfit parenting. So there was no abuse or neglect that needed to be proven. It was just Indigenous people are unfit parents. We need to remove children. So that was the standard at the time. And social services had that standard of anyone who wasn't raising their child with European values is unfit. So that particular model was into the 80s and then early 90s, I believe. Then the millennial scoop is where things get a little sneakier, if you will, a little less overt. Yes, so there are some other, just taking a look at the chat, just for everyone to be up to speed. There are, I think that BC is a little bit more advanced on that. There are still some other places in Canada that are still, there's very racially motivated reasons for removal, and people coming in, taking children like newborns out of parents' arms. I just saw one, this might be the one you're talking about, either Manitoba or Saskatchewan, where the social worker kind of, from the perspective of the person recording and speaking, the social worker kind of ghosted the family. The grandmother of this newborn was approved for taking custody of the child, taking the baby home, all of that stuff. And then the social worker kind of ghosted, like just stopped replying, and they were trying to get a hold of them. There was no answers, all of these things, but that social worker sent in an apprehension thing I don't know what the actual wording is called, but they came in to take the baby, even though it was already discussed that grandma was going to take it. So yeah, there are still very corrupt instances, and there's going to be corrupt individuals and corrupt people in power in all of the systems, no matter what, no matter where you are. Okay, there's going to be corruption. It's not completely gone. So some places are a little bit further behind on their cultural safety journey, unfortunately. All right, so this next section is kind of bringing it all together. We're going to get into what cultural safety is. I've been giving you a lot of doom and gloom, and I feel bad about it. I'm so sorry. So these are going to be some steps. These are going to be some tools for you to articulate anti-racism a little bit better, have discussions about it, have conversations. I want to give you all the ammunition you need to have a conversation with people or have a conversation as it comes up. So cultural safety is actually a healthcare specific definition because it came out of the New Zealand healthcare system in the 1980s. And so where it kind of came out is there were Maori people that were in the midwifery practicum. They were students. And so they noticed that they were getting treated not great, actually horribly, compared to the non-Indigenous students. So that's when we kind of saw a rise, or not an inquest, but people started kind of asking questions, and they found that this actually applies to clients and patients in healthcare as well. So they coined the term cultural safety. And there's some questions around, is cultural safety as a term inherently Indigenous focused, or is Indigenous cultural safety specifying? The earliest time that we see cultural safety has to do with Indigenous peoples. So if you see cultural safety as a term, know that it can be applied everywhere, but most likely it is a very Indigenous focused term, okay? So it's an outcome based on respectful engagement that recognizes and strives to address power imbalances inherent in the healthcare system. But we can replace healthcare system with any system, okay? This applies everywhere. It results in an environment free of racism and discrimination where people feel safe when receiving healthcare, social services, entering public spaces. Like, we can replace that with anything. So on this journey, cultural avoidance is kind of refusing to recognize someone else's reality, not having a conversation, kind of staying in their lane and expecting others to stay in their lane as well. Cultural awareness is having a very surface level understanding of other cultures, but not really a deeper knowledge. I would say that these people at this stage would recognize food, music, games, festivals, but they would have a little bit of the history, but it would be what we see in mainstream media. Knowledge that's given to us in mainstream media, not anything really deeper, not trying to avoid possibly saying the wrong thing or saying something ignorant, like not taking steps to not be ignorant, let's say. Cultural sensitivity, the definition that I'm going to give in the context of Indigenous cultural safety, is different from diversity, equity, and inclusion models. Okay, so don't get the two confused. This is what we define it as. So cultural sensitivity in our definition is basically everything coming out of your mouth is totally fine, culturally safe, not ignorant. You take steps to learn more, but it's lacking the environment piece. So this would be when we excuse ourselves from conversations because people are being racist, or we kind of are like, oh, I can't engage with this, I need to walk away. And that definitely serves a time and a place. A lot of people's personal lives focus around cultural sensitivity. So this would be like family dinners. We don't really want to call out people's behavior at those family dinners, or when you're meeting someone's parents for the first time. Like, there's definitely a level of protecting ourselves in that and in those spaces. Cultural safety, which is what we really encourage and is standard for workplaces is when someone is saying something or doing something that's racist, we put a stop to the behavior, whether by talking to them and saying, hey, I don't know if you know, but what you just said like came across as a little racist. And I know that you're not that kind of person. So I just wanted to talk to you about it. Or if it's active harm that's occurring and we're saying, hey, that's racist, that's not okay, you need to stop right now. We're monitoring the environment and there's accountability for everyone to be on the same page, which is lacking with sensitivity. It's just accepting where people are at and kind of leaving when we need to. Now, cultural advocacy as a stage, because there's advocacy to cultural safety as well. Cultural advocacy as a stage is a step above and beyond. It's like you're recognizing environments that you're not invited to really, or like you actively look for spaces that need to be changed and advocate for cultural safety. So in your personal lives, this could be posting things on social media or posting about the 215 children when they were recovered. It could be wearing orange on Canada Day instead of red. That is advocacy. That's putting cultural safety in the spaces of people that might not be on that level, if that makes sense. Does anyone have any questions here? I'm just recognizing time that we have. We're at the 20-minute point before we're done. All right, gonna skip ahead. These are just some different trauma responses I wanted people to be aware of. When people are activated, sometimes I don't say triggered, because there's a difference between, in my mind, there's a difference between being triggered as someone like I have PTSD. And my difference is activated is when I'm in an elevated state because of a trigger or because of a response. Being triggered is like you're 0 to 100, you're not in your right space, you are panicking, and you're exhibiting really drastic outcomes. So people can experience this as fight, flight, freeze, flop, friend, or even fawning, which isn't on here, even when they're activated, not when they're just triggered. Okay, so I don't think we'll have time to really deep dive into this, but I want people to be able to recognize this possibly in coworkers, family, friends, or in the patients and clients that we serve. Okay, most people are just familiar with fight, flight, freeze, but there's also flop. There's also fawn, which is where we just are agreeable. We don't speak up for ourselves. We just kind of go back into a people pleasing. This is very common in women, or feminine presenting people. It's a very common experience for them. And then friend, this is where we're relying our responsibility on others or kind of defaulting almost to like other people and not taking responsibility. So yeah, just to recognize this. And if we have time, we can come back to it. Now, for trauma in different forms, when we're taking a look at the medicine wheel, physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, I wanted to give people an opportunity to look at this as well, and seeing how trauma and trauma responses can affect all of these aspects of a person's self. We want to operate with an idea behind the medicine wheel that if one of these are off, something is disconnected. The whole person needs to we need to get these quadrants at a 10 out of 10, basically, for a whole person to be 10 out of 10. So again, we don't have the ability to deep dive into it, but having it up here for people to have an opportunity to read, look back at later because it's recorded and the slides are going to be uploaded, or just to even take a screenshot right now, or people that probably they might have their phones taking a photo of the screen. I know that happens. Just having it there. I'm just checking the chat real quick. Okay, I see a question in the chat, but I think we might leave that for end discussion if that's okay. I love the conversation though. So the In Plain Sight report, for those that aren't familiar, it was a report that looked at BC's healthcare system for anti-Indigenous racism. And this came out in 2020, November, I believe. But the final publication, I think, was February. 2021. It could be wrong though. You can look this up. There's a summary and then there's the full one. And that's really long. It's like 300 pages. But what they outlined as the common areas for harm is emergency, pediatrics, maternity, ICU, mental health and substance use, and home care. And so when we take a look at these environments in healthcare, we see these bubbles on the edge as very common environment between all of these spaces. So anxiety on both sides, the person receiving care and the person providing it, high stress, both sides, quick decisions, both sides, urgency, both sides, a high cognitive load for the healthcare providers, and a certain level of meta stereotyping in these situations that is allowed, like clinical or clinical suspicion, for example, gives us this freedom to kind of stereotype, to make assumptions. And so when there are other prejudices in our brains, the line of which stereotypes are okay and which ones are harmful kind of gets blurred. So this is what happens in these high stress, high urgency, pardon me, anxiety and quick decisions, okay? So if you're in situations where you're finding yourself rushed or you're feeling a lot of anxiety about the next choices, this is when harm is going to occur, because what happens is we kind of go into autopilot. And if you've ever been autopilot driving, you will like totally check out and then be like, how did I already get here? Like, I wasn't even paying attention. I don't even know if I stopped for that red light. You did, but you wouldn't have been able to deal with things as well if it came up, if someone threw a ball into the road and someone chased after it. So similarly, this is what's going to happen when our healthcare system is overworked. So when we're working with people that we know are often victims of anti-Indigenous racism or discrimination, this is when we need to make sure that we don't allow ourselves to go into autopilot, that we're very intentional with the choices, decisions, and treatment that we're giving someone. Now, does anyone have any questions here? All right, skipping ahead. This slide is just to highlight that when we talk about racism, people automatically think that racism only exists person to person. If you think, oh, anti-racism training, most people came into the session learning or assuming that we would be talking about individuals being racist to another person. But there's institutional racism and systemic, which we looked at with that structure. So when we're addressing racism, there's a few ways to approach this, and I kind of mentioned both. Call out is a one-way conversation. We see racist behavior and we say, hey, whoa, not okay, stop it or get out. And an example of this is something that was shared one of the sessions that I did. There was an Indigenous person who came to the emergency room escorted by an RCMP officer. I don't know if it was mental health or something, but either way, both of them were there. And the RCMP officer was being overtly racist towards this Indigenous person. And the physician, it was very scary to do because of that power control, right? But this physician said, hey, you're being really racist to my patient. It's not okay. You can either change your behavior and stay, or you can get out. This is unacceptable. And that aligned them as a potential ally to the Indigenous person receiving care. Because think about it, if we took a call-in approach, which is saying, hey, can I talk to you outside, or waiting for a later time to call attention to the behavior? Think about someone who has trauma with RCMP and has trauma with healthcare system as an Indigenous person and the systems. If your healthcare provider and the police officer that brought you in stepped outside after the police officer was making racist comments, I would not feel safe. I would think that they're talking worse about me in my absence. Now that, well, we can't hear what they're saying, they're going to be even worse, more ruthless. So that is a situation where calling in would have caused further harm. Calling out was the necessary choice in that situation because active harm was occurring and calling in would have caused more. Now, lean in isn't a response to racism, it is a prevention. It's when we kind of just check in, and we want to avoid checking in with just Indigenous people we know, unless they're an educator or they have kind of said like, hey, if anyone needs anything, you know, come chat with me. I identify myself as an educator, so my door is always open for questions from people. But what we don't want is people doing a territory acknowledgement and then going to their Indigenous colleague and saying, hey, do you have any feedback on that? Do you have anything I can work on? We don't want to burden people in that way unless they offer it. So lean in is actively looking for ways to improve. That's really it. So culturally safe organizations look like a commitment to ongoing learning of colonial history, addressing colonial and corporate power imbalances, and developing professional anti-racism standards and strategies. Some reconciliation practices that honestly people take this and apply it to their personal life. And I wanted to sprinkle some of that in for you today, is to stay informed. A really good news source to follow is APTN News, the Aboriginal People's Television Network. A lot of Indigenous issues are reported there. They'll post opportunities, they'll post information. This is a really good news source to follow. Buying from Indigenous businesses, people, nonprofits, contractors, artists. This is a step towards reconciliation and supporting Indigenous people as well. Thinking Indigenous, applying decolonial methods to your approaches. Remember, kinesthetic really benefited a lot of people. So decolonial approaches are going to benefit a lot of people as well. Apply two-eyed seeing, which is where we ask ourselves, how can we fit in the Western ways that we have to do things in our policies how can we use our Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge to work together for a huge benefit for everybody? Think in 7 generations. How is this going to affect my children, my children's children, my friends' children's children, if you're not going to have children yourself? How is this going to affect the next 7 generations of people? And passing on what you've learned. If you hear someone, talking about how residential schools happened 100 years ago and they're still crying about it, you can say, actually, no, they closed in 1996. There's a lot of evidence to suggest otherwise. So pass on what you've learned, maybe gift someone a book, deliver a presentation, but really continue the learning. And one of the best ways to learn and to solidify new information in your brain is to teach other people. And that's a statistically proven fact in any form of learning. If you teach, it gets in your brain a lot better. So I wanted to leave us at the end with this quote, actually Lended, these are his slides. Safety is not the absence of threat, but it's the presence of connection. So with that, I want to thank you all for connecting with me today. This is my email. If anyone, I have my personal email there. You can email my personal email, or you can email my first name, Marissa, at lenprconsulting.com. And if you have any questions, any follow-up, you're more than welcome to contact me. And if you don't want to, then I hope our paths meet again. But thank you so much for spending time with me today. And now is the open time for questions and comments. Actually, I saw one in the chat. Can hospitals hire more spiritual care representatives to help that are non-denominational, and would that help? Absolutely, I think so. At Fraser Health, again, I'm not coming as a representative of Fraser Health today, but we have spiritual health that connects people that are not Indigenous specific, but people with, if they want to see a pastor, if they want to connect with their spirituality, their religion in healthcare. But then we also have Indigenous liaisons that connect people with the same thing. So I absolutely think that that's a really good idea. I will say, there's obviously funding and all of those bureaucratic processes that go on. So I believe a lot of spiritual care is volunteers. So I think that would absolutely help, but it's also about making sure that the public knows that that's a resource, because we have a lot of resources for people, but it's not so readily known. Which is why just having individuals that work within healthcare know about all of the services that are available is going to help, because you can say, hey, we can connect you with these people. Did you not know? Like, I can do it right now. So just making sure that like staff and public are informed.
Hi, Marissa. This is
Hi.
Sherry. I
Hi.
was just wondering, when I was working in one of the hospitals here on the island, in the southern part of the island, we had a residential school survivor who came in, and, you know, she's, was lovely, and we tried to give as much time and space for her to share, or to, try to deal with some of the trauma that she had. But sometimes, even if we weren't short-staffed, it's hard. Like, you literally just don't have that time. And you feel bad because you do have to go see other people, and whether it's a 4-bedroom or something, and you could spend an hour with her and then, give somebody else their pills. And then, she would say you're being racist or discriminatory because you're ignoring her now. And I know the family was wonderful and really supportive too. And they said, she would say the same things with them. Like, it was a bucket that could never be filled, or do you know what I mean? Or retain any of the water that you pour into it. Like, it just, my child feels the same way sometimes, you know what I mean? Like, it's just this never ending need. And I feel the same way with him. Like, how do you ever make it feel like you've got something in your bucket? But I don't know, how, is there any suggestions or any readings for that? Like, it just seemed like even 24/7, they're just, and it's likely based on the trauma. Like, there's just so much to deal with, and it will never be fully dealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. It is really hard because at the end of the day, like, we do have time constraints. We do have other people that we need to see. And so even if you're giving 5 minutes, like, if you're transparency is huge, I think. Like, when we're going into for a health situation, like, if I'm going to the emergency room, theoretically I'm having the worst day of my life. So there's that. We're not going to see that many positive things. I think there's lots of studies obviously that show that, like, negative gets into our brain a lot more than positive interactions do. So even if that particular person is a bucket that's never going to get full, like a bottomless bucket that is going to be unhappy whether you spend 2 hours with them or 5 hours with them, the fact that you're doing it to the best of your ability is setting an example for other people, and also any other Indigenous people that may not either identify themselves as Indigenous, but they see it and they see that effort that you're putting in. It's definitely for the person that we're working with. But it doesn't just impact that person. Because when I go to these spaces and I see someone like being really great with an elder, like, if you look at me, I don't look Indigenous. I look like a white lady. And I'm very aware of that. And so I kind of like sneak around. I'm kind of like a little spy almost, and I slide under the radar. And so when I see people like spending time with others, letting them talk, letting them do their thing, tell them their life story, I notice those things. And I'm like, wow, that's really great. That's incredible. So it's not just for that person. And if you're trying your best, that's all you can do. Like, you can just spend as much time with the person as you physically can, and having that transparent moment of, I really wish I could stay longer. I'm so sorry. But other people, I just need to go check on these people. And if I have time, I'll come back. You're allowed to do that. You're allowed to say that. So just that openness, that honesty, that's going to help.
Yeah, and I think part of it was dementia as well. Like I said, there was a lot of, her family was kind of done in as well, part with the dementia, because a lot of accusations with them and, all that. And they were getting a bit of a burnout. And so it's hard, but yeah, we had a wonderful spiritual, I don't know if you say leader or something, who was Aboriginal herself as well. So she could, sit in that space and was able to give a bit more time when, so that would be a call I'd make. But I wish more hospitals had more, that you could have somebody who needs that one-on-one and needs that somebody to listen to difficult things more than we have time for.
Yeah, and that's where I think the like volunteers for spiritual health, and I could be wrong, I could be misspeaking, but a lot of the volunteers do that from my understanding, because they're volunteers, they're volunteering their time. So yeah, I mean, even with that person, it seems like the family would have noticed how well you were treating them. So just, this is for everyone. It's not just for individuals, like we're setting an example for others. I know it's 6:29, so does anyone else have any questions?
Well, we just wanted to say thank you very, very much, Marissa, for coming and speaking to us tonight. That was a great, wonderful talk, very informative.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll give everyone another minute there for questions, but if none, I'm going to say thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for being here, and thank you for the questions that came through in the chat. The chat engagement, like I said, I know some people they don't really want to ask questions, especially when there's recordings. So if you want to email me after, you're more than welcome to do so. We can, maybe if it's a deeper conversation, set up a chat or something.
Wonderful. And if anyone needs Marissa's email, feel free to shoot us an email and we can connect you as well. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Marissa.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Have a good week, everyone.
Wonderful evening.